if you pay close attention to the news every day, there's only one conclusion you can come to about where we're headed. Because as long as the media convinces you of this, you're primed to keep reading, keep watching, keep tuning in. The media is trying to sell you a false narrative. What they don't want you to know is this: things are better than you think. In the next hour or so, I'm going to talk about why the Daily News doesn't tell you the whole story. And I'm going to discuss some ways to transform the narrative and to figure out what's really going on. And finally, I'll explain why I'm an optimist. Most of you are entrepreneurs, most of you are optimists. And why I believe things are better than you think. My goal is simple. I want to change how you see the news. I want to change what you pay attention to when you read the newspaper, watch TV, scan your Twitter feed. I'm going to talk about 9 trends that say we aren't really headed to hell. And after that, there'll be some time for questions. So let's begin. I'm going to start with a quick news quiz. Do you know what happened on December 7, 1941? Pearl Harbor, there you go. November 22, 1963. Kennedy assassination. Smart group. You're definitely going to get the next one. September 11, 2001. And how about March 8th of last year? I'll give you a hint. It was the biggest news story of the year.
Kim Kardashian.
There you go. It was an airplane crash that killed 239 people, and it got a huge amount of news coverage. Now, I'm going to walk you through how the New York Times covered the story, because they're less sensationalist than most. Here's day 2, day 3. Day 4, it's almost half the front page. I'm not saying this wasn't a tragedy. If you had family members on board, it would change your life forever. But for the rest of us, was this really the most important story in the world for more than a week? Was it really the most important story of the year? It was on the front page for 10 days, saturation coverage. So the question is, why? Do you have any ideas?
Take our eye off the ball.
Sells paper, what was it?
Take our eye off something else.
Take our eye off something else, sells newspapers. Here's what I think. I think it was because it was surprising. It was a mystery story. Where'd the plane go? Was there a conspiracy? And there's another reason, which is that flying is number 7 on the list of the top 10 fears. It's very common. So let me ask you, how many of you flew in here from out of town? And how many of you were just a little bit fearful about getting on the plane? It's entrepreneurs. A normal audience, half the hands go up. Fear of flying is very common. So this is the beginning of my argument. If you believe what you see in the Daily News, flying is terrifying. What's the real news?
Very safe.
The real news is that 2014 had the fewest crashes in the history of air travel. This is one day's plane flights in the US. You'll notice that none of them crashed. The blue line is the number of passengers. Compared to the 70s, there are 10 times as many, and the number of deaths is 1/5 what it was. Flying is 50 times safer than 40 years ago. Can you imagine if cars were 50 times safer? But the media won't miss an airplane story. A few months ago, a plane skidded off a runway at LaGuardia. There were a few minor injuries, nobody was seriously hurt, but it made the front page of the New York Times. Even though the story is, nothing happened. Move along here, folks. And then a few weeks later, there was another plane crash that I'm sure you've heard about. Again, I'm not saying this wasn't a tragedy, but as Chris Anderson from the TED conference tweeted, 150,000 people die each day, but if 100 die in an airplane, it hijacks the world's attention for weeks. Here we go again. And he was right. Again, it was on the front page every day for more than a week. And then there it was again on day 25. And then on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, 43 days after it happened. Okay, I'm going to move on from plane crashes. Let's look at another story from a year earlier. April 15, 2013. Anybody remember this one? Again, biggest story of the year. It's the Boston Marathon bombings. It's a tragedy that killed 3 people, injured 264. Don't get me wrong, I'm not dismissing the tragedy. My wife worries that I sound really heartless talking about this stuff. But what I'm really questioning is the media narrative. I'm going to ask you to imagine two scenarios. Scenario one, you're at the finish line. You see the explosion. You see the aftermath. And you watch as they take people to the hospital. Scenario two, you're at home watching the story on TV. You get sucked in, as we so often do. And over the next few days, you watch the coverage for maybe 6 hours. Now I ask, between those two scenarios, who was more traumatized? A, people at the finish line, or B, people watching on TV? How many think it was A? How many think it was B? Here's the crazy thing. It was B. The people who were at home watching TV for 6 hours were 9 times more likely to report acute stress than people at the finish line. Watching the news was more traumatic than being there. So why does the story get so much coverage? Do you guys have any ideas?
Fear of terror.
Fear of terror? That's what I think. It's fear of terrorism. How many of you out-of-towners thought twice about coming to New York because this is where terror attacks happen? Oh, again, entrepreneurs, they're brave. It's really a subset of a deeper fear, which is the fear of dying is number 2 on the list of top 10 fears. Actually, by the way, fear number 1 is what I'm doing right now, public speaking. So what's the real news? Here's the things that are more likely to kill you than terrorism. You have a 1 in 84 chance of dying in a car crash during your lifetime. Every year in the US, car crashes kill 32,000 people. That's the same as a 737 crashing every day and killing everybody on board. This is your risk of suicide. When you add in murders, guns now kill more people in the US than cars. This is your lifetime risk of dying from poison or in a fall, and so on, and so on. Yes, planes do sometimes crash. There are lots and lots of ways to die. This is your lifetime risk of getting killed by a coconut. Or struck by lightning. Lightning is number 10 on the list of top 10 fears, but it's way down on the list of things that will actually kill you. Getting caught in a fire. Tipping over a bookshelf or a TV set. Trying to get your soda out of a vending machine. This is your risk of being attacked by a shark, but it probably won't kill you because only 1 out of 5 shark attacks is fatal. And what's your lifetime risk of dying in a terrorist attack? It's 1 in 20 million. You're 4,000 times more likely to die in a plane crash and 240,000 times more likely to die in a car crash. Terrorism causes less than 2% of violent deaths, and violent deaths, while they get all the media coverage, are basically insignificant. Violence is just 1.1% of all deaths. Heart disease, stroke, cancer, kidney disease, all much higher on the list of killers. In other words, terrorism accounts for just a tiny, tiny fraction of all deaths. So what I'm suggesting is that the attention we pay to news media has costs. Here's a recent estimate. The war on terror has cost US taxpayers nearly $1.7 trillion. And the cost will continue. Terrorism is now the public's #1 policy priority, ahead of the economy. That's the cost of a false narrative. We're pouring enormous resources into the war on terrorism because we're terrified. And it's fueled by the news media because news is driven by ratings. And ratings are driven by fear. Let's take a look at the top 10 stories of last year and see if we can identify the fear the media is playing on. We talked about this one, fear of flying. Fear of disease from scary places overseas. Depending on your point of view, this could be fear of police or fear of African American men. Fear of our former Cold War enemy, Russia. Fear of Muslims. Again, depending on your point of view, fear of Arabs or fear of Jews. Fear of Hispanics. Fear of homosexuals. Fear of cyber terrorism. You have to go pretty far down the list to get to a story that isn't driven by fear. Although some Democrats are afraid of Republicans, some Republicans are afraid of Democrats. The point is, fear turns us into a captive audience, hooked on the next shocking story they'll bring us tonight at 11. Because if you're human, you're fascinated by bad news, and you ignore good news. Last year, a news site in Russia decided to print only good news for a day. You know what happened? They lost 2/3 of their readers. Nobody in journalism is going to try that again in a hurry. That's the real media bias, not liberal or conservative. But if it bleeds, it leads. So in the face of that, how do you figure out what's really going on? How do you transform the narrative? How do you find the real news? Well, I have 4 suggestions for you. First, when you see a news story, ask yourself this question. Will this matter a year from now? It's shocking how many of the news stories on the front page, the answer to that is no. Second, as Michael Shermer suggests, follow the trend lines, not the headlines. If you know flying is 50 times safer than it was in the 70s, maybe you won't feel the need to think about one plane crash for 43 days. Third, don't get caught up in the cycle of fear. Shutting down the city of Boston for a week-long manhunt might have been overkill, don't you think? And finally, get your news from lots and lots of sources. In particular, I encourage you to seek out news outlets you don't agree with, that give you a different point of view. Because the way to get the real news is to read between the lines, to look for stories that give you clues about where we're headed, that might even help you predict the future. In the late 50s, there was an artist named Arthur Radbaugh who drew his predictions. He missed on some. We still don't have flap-wing fly cars, as awesome as those would be. And so far, we don't have mining on the moon. But even so, things are better than you think. And I'm going to take the rest of my time to show you why I believe that. I'm going to talk about 9 trends that I follow. Some you may find familiar, some have been talked about earlier this week, but I hope a few are new to you. But I want to stress, these are my storylines. I'm from San Francisco, so I happen to be biased towards stories about how technology is changing the world. And because I live in the US, you've probably already noticed I'm kind of US focused. Your interests are going to be different based on your own business, your own view of the world, but what I'm suggesting is that you should be thinking about following trends, not necessarily the news of the day. So let's turn to the first trend. I'd like to take another quick survey of the room. In the past 25 years, do you think global poverty, A, almost doubled, B, stayed the same, or C, was cut by 2/3? How many think it was A? How many think it was B? And how many think it was C? Okay, you guys are ahead of the curve because across the US, 65% choose A, but the actual answer, as you guessed, is C. So that's my first trend. We're getting wealthier. In 1981, 53% of the world population was living in poverty. Now it's down to 17%. And that decline in poverty really started 2 centuries ago. Globally, we've lifted about 1 billion people out of extreme poverty in the last 25 years. But that's not what gets reported. As you know, most of the economic news since 2007 has been about the terrible state of the economy. Here's the real news. The most recent recession was just a blip. This chart starts in 1871, ends in 2009, where you can see the downturn. Here are the more recent figures. We're back on the upward trend everywhere in the world. Gross domestic product isn't everything, but we are a zillion times wealthier than we were 500 years ago. Back then, a peasant would have just 1 shirt, 2 at the most. Why? Because they were so expensive. Before automation, making a shirt took 400 hours of spinning, 72 hours of weaving, 7 hours of sewing. If you paid those workers the equivalent of minimum wage, that's when shirts cost $3,500. We've gotten wealthier because so many things have gotten cheaper. This is the cost of lighting as we went from candlelight to whale oil to electricity, which is why our world looks like this at night. 100 years ago, it took 2 years of an average worker's salary to buy a new car. Now it takes about 6 months. Back in the 50s, a wall-to-wall television was a sci-fi fantasy. Now, not only does it exist, but the cost of big screen TVs keep falling. 15 years ago, a 50-inch TV cost $20,000. Last year at Walmart, it was $218. And while things have been getting cheaper, work has been getting easier. Most work used to be backbreaking because most people had to work on farms. This is the share of the labor force working in agriculture. It used to take 75% of the population to feed us. Now it takes less than 2%. And back then, the second most common job title after farmer was domestic worker. Because before washing machines, simply doing the laundry for an average family took 2 days a week. So goods are cheaper, labor's less laborious, and although it may not feel like it, we're working fewer hours a week than ever before. This is the UK, but the trend is true everywhere in the developed world. Here's Germany, France, the US. Overall, we're working about 30 hours less a week. And meanwhile, globally, the middle class keeps growing. Look at the areas in blue. The poor are continuing to get wealthier too. Extreme poverty is projected to drop to 4.9% in the next 15 years. That's down from the 17% we talked about a few minutes ago. The world's seeing progress against undernutrition. In 1990, a quarter of the global population was hungry. Now that's been cut in half. Here's what the declines look like on a map. Red is hungry, green is less hungry. In the US, the elderly are among the biggest winners in the war on poverty. Their poverty rate's now 10%, down from 30% 50 years ago. Now, as I've been talking, I'm sure you've been thinking of a counter trend. We've seen a lot of economic growth without new jobs. Income inequality is increasing in major US cities and around the world. This is the top 1% of earners. Starting in the 70s, their share of national income has returned to levels from a century ago. Meanwhile, worker salaries in the US have basically stayed flat since 1973 as productivity has doubled. So to sum up, poverty is falling faster than ever, but the 1% are racing ahead. Let's move on to a second trend. We're getting healthier. In the past century, we've cut the rate of deaths in half, mostly by eliminating a huge percentage of infectious diseases. More of us are dying today of cancer and heart disease because we're now living long enough to get them. Still, in the past 50 years, we've made great strides against heart disease and stroke. Even cancer's down slightly. And 10-year cancer survival rates are improving for almost all forms of the disease. Globally, since 1990, almost every major disease has been on the decline. That big red spike is AIDS, but even AIDS-related deaths have been on the decline since 2005. Fewer and fewer mothers are dying in childbirth. Child mortality has dropped 47% since 1990. There's been a dramatic fall in measles deaths. One reason we're getting healthier is that modern medicine keeps producing miracles. Here are a few just since the beginning of this year. A nanorobots trial began in humans. It targets leukemia cells without harming healthy tissue. There's now a stem cell therapy to reverse multiple sclerosis. Ultrasound that restores memory in Alzheimer's mice. Of the mice that got the treatment, 75% got their memory functions back. A team is building a bionic pancreas, a gadget that tracks blood sugar and automatically administers insulin. There's another gadget that tests for age using an iPhone. And researchers are closing in on printing a 3D heart valve. Donor shortages could be a thing of the past. There are a few negative health trends to keep an eye on. The toll of traffic accidents is rising in poor countries as more people can afford cars. Global cigarette consumption and the number of smokers is climbing, and cigarettes kill about 5 million people a year. Plus, smoke from cook stoves is killing almost as many people as cigarettes. Indoor air pollution is putting 3 billion people at risk of an early death. In the US, obesity is still on the rise. It cuts 14 years off your lifespan. So that as the numbers of obese people grow, life expectancies may go down. While I'm mentioning life expectancy, I said we're now living long enough to get cancer and heart disease. That's our third trend. We're living longer. In Roman times, the average life expectancy at birth was about 22 years. You might live longer, but you had to get lucky. By 1900, the average life expectancy at birth had gone up. Now it was about 30. But since 1950, life expectancy has gone from 47 to 70 for everyone on the planet. In the US, it's approaching 80. It's 83 in Japan. Here's another way of looking at it. Compared to a century ago, each of us has now been granted more than 2 lifetimes. Meanwhile, the number of centenarians has doubled, and 2/3 of the babies born this year may well be alive a century from now. Of course, the obesity epidemic might lower life expectancies for some, or another global pandemic like the flu back in 1918. But other than that, there's no reason to believe this century-long trend won't continue. And if it does, we may have to confront a new question. Do you want to live to 120? Assuming you could remain as healthy as, say, a 50 or 60-year-old for most of that time. How many of you want to live that long? How many of you don't? In a US poll, 56% said they wouldn't want to. But 68% thought most other people would. And there's even a growing movement asking another question. Can we live forever? You might dismiss this out of hand if there weren't some very serious people talking about it. Google has started a company called Calico with $1.5 billion in funding to develop drugs that will tackle aging as if it were just another disease. Craig Venter, who sequenced the human genome, has a new startup that's hacking life. It's called Human Longevity. A few months ago, President Obama proposed a DNA database of 1 million people, an initiative to look for clues to health and aging in our DNA. It's happening now because it's less and less expensive to gather the data, and we're getting better at genetic engineering. Scientists are trying to genetically modify human eggs to correct inheritable diseases, and they're working on engineering the perfect baby. At MIT, they're saying edited humans are 10 to 20 years away. So how many of you think it would be okay to modify a baby to make it more intelligent? How about modifying a baby to reduce the risk of serious diseases? In the US, 83%, kind of like this room actually, think that modifying genes to make a baby more intelligent is going too far. But it's an even split when the gene modification is to reduce the risk of serious disease. So it's going to be interesting to see how public attitudes shift as these technologies become more available. I'm now going to talk about a trend you might have a hard time agreeing with me on. I believe peace and justice are spreading around the world. How many of you think this is true? Entrepreneurs, my people. This is the number of democracies around the world. More than half the world's population now lives in a democracy. Here's a world map that shows the same thing. Although a troubling note is that by some measures, democracy may have actually retreated in the past 10 years. At the same time, worldwide battle deaths are on the downswing, partly because democracies tend not to fight each other. Only one trans-border war occurred in 2013. In fact, Steven Pinker has shown that violence of all kinds is on the decline everywhere you look. That's part of why we find violence so shocking today and why the news media reports on it wherever it occurs in the world. Of course there are conflicts over religion, over ethnicity, over concepts of right and wrong. The UN reveals alarmingly high levels of violence against women. More than 1 in 3 women worldwide has experienced physical violence or rape. Neo-Nazi activity is on the rise. There are also hate crimes against Muslims and Christians. But despite these ills and many others, I'd argue we're slowly making progress. Racism is waning. A recent study shows that every generation of Americans has grown more tolerant of people with views and lifestyles different from their own. With one exception, Americans are less tolerant of people with racist beliefs. The number of women lawmakers has doubled to 21% worldwide, up from 11% in 1997. And this is the world's percentage of women in executive roles. Slow, but progress. This map shows where homosexuality is illegal. In the countries marked in black, it gets you the death penalty. And yet Ireland, one of the most Catholic countries on earth, just voted to change their constitution to make gay marriage legal. And in the US, most Americans now support same-sex marriage. As I'm sure you will agree, these developments would have been unthinkable as recently as a decade ago. Okay, we've looked at trends in wealth, health, longevity, social justice. Now I want to talk about what we're doing to the planet. This is trend 5. For better or worse, we are changing the world. They're calling the time we live in the Anthropocene, the age of humans. Geologists can now see signs of the start of the Industrial Revolution in ice cores and rock formations. Some of what's going on, the world's demographics are changing. Half the world's population now lives here. And half the world population now lives in cities. By 2050, that number will reach 70%. As a result, there's more building going on than ever before in history. China used more concrete in the past 3 years than the US used in the entire 20th century. And because of all the building we're doing and better building codes, there's another surprising trend. Natural disasters used to be so much worse. In the past century, the death rate from natural catastrophes dropped by 97%. Here's the death rate from fire in the US. And there's been an amazing decline in deaths from extreme weather. In 1950, 433,000 people. Last year, 27,500. The built world is a safer world, but the Anthropocene, as we know, has consequences. We're polluting the oceans. 8 million tons of plastic are dumped in the ocean every year. And we're polluting the atmosphere. How many of you are concerned about climate change? CO2 levels are now over 400 parts per million. Every indicator we have says mankind is changing the climate. The sea level north of New York City jumped by 5 inches last year. Researchers have linked the Syrian conflict to a long drought that's been made worse by climate change, and so far it's displaced 6 million people. This is NASA's projection of drought in North America over the next century. But if you look hard, you can find a plus side. Warming has meant that the planet's actually getting greener. This shows what's happened in the last 30 years. And despite deforestation, the world actually added vegetation between 2003 and 2013. The US has more trees than it had a century ago. I'd like to spend another moment talking about climate change. Here's what isn't controversial. 97% of climate scientists say the climate's changing. And they also say it's caused by human activity, mostly burning coal and oil. Where it gets controversial is this. It's unclear how bad the consequences will be. And it's unclear how soon they'll arrive. And so as a result, it's a little bit unclear what we should do about it and how quickly. This is a sculpture by a Spanish artist. It's called Politicians Discuss Global Warming. Unfortunately, it isn't a joke. Just a few months ago, officials in Florida banned the term climate change. That'll solve the problem. And the US Senate voted not long ago that climate change isn't caused by humans. Next, maybe they'll vote that the Earth is actually flat. But ultimately, most can agree it would probably be a good idea to wean ourselves off coal and oil. And that's trend 6. We are finding new sources of energy. Just a few examples out of many I could have chosen. Thanks to fracking, US carbon emissions are at their lowest levels in 20 years. That's good news, but there's no free lunch. Fracking is causing earthquakes and high levels of benzene in water supplies. Meanwhile, globally, renewables are already generating about 10% of our power. Global wind installations were up 42% last year. Solar industry jobs are going at 20 times the national rate, partly because the price of solar panels has dropped by a factor of 100. So at this rate, it looks like renewables may produce 20% of our power 15 years from now, and about a third by 2050. And at the fringes of the energy business, there's some crazy experiments going on. I'll mention just 3. Earlier this year, the world's first wave power station was connected to the electrical grid in Australia. Later this year, Tesla is launching a battery that's a game changer for the grid. It can store solar energy for use at night. And the National Ignition Facility has achieved record energies. What that means is we seem to be making progress towards creating fusion energy, man-made solar power. And what about nuclear power? How many of you think we should be using nuclear power? And how many of you don't? Well, my bias is I think it's a shame we don't use more nuclear power than we do, because I think this is another case where fear, driven by the media, hasn't done us any favors. Do you remember April 7, 2011? Fukushima. The second biggest news story of the year, the Japan earthquake and tsunami. 7.4 magnitude quake, northwest Japan, biggest earthquake Japan had ever seen. The tsunami waves topped historic heights. But the narrative quickly became all about the explosion at the Fukushima nuclear plant. This is how it was reported. Fukushima, a nuclear threat to Japan, the US, and the world. Thousands staged anti-nuclear protests in Tokyo and around the globe. Germany announced they would shut down their entire nuclear industry, even though nuclear generates 22% of their electricity. So again, I ask, what's the real news? 16,000 people died in the flooding near Fukushima. To this day, not one has died because of the meltdown at the nuclear plant. This is the death rate of various types of power. That little tiny box is nuclear. Nevertheless, out of fear, Germany's switching their energy production from nuclear back to coal, and as a result, they're missing their own goals. Carbon emissions are climbing again. And the fear-mongering continues. Just about a month ago, 4 years after the accident, this headline appeared. Fukushima radiation has reached North American shores. Here's how scared you should be. If you swam in the Vancouver Bay 6 hours a day for 1,000 years, you'd have the same radiation exposure as one dental x-ray. So why was this even a news story? Fear, right? But the pendulum does swing. I happen to think this next story was good news, though some of you might disagree. Back in April, this headline appeared. 4 years after Fukushima, Japan considers restarting their nuclear facilities. On to trend 7. We are getting smarter, especially the people in this room. This is years of education per person globally since 1950. Meanwhile, the number of children who aren't in school at all is dropping. Look what's happened in Africa. In 60 years, the continent went from less than 2 years of schooling for most people to around 7 years of schooling for most people. This is global literacy. Anything blue is above 80%. This is what it looks like since 1980, a 20% jump. But how does the news media report on this progress? The world fails to reach Millennium Education targets.
Sorry, Jack, I get that.
Siri. Perfect. Could you save that for a little bit later in the talk? Yes, there's work to be done, but headlines like this miss the real story. Unfortunately, there's definitely work to be done in the US. Students are sliding in global rankings, not even cracking the top 20 in math, reading, or science. But even so, education is spreading, and as a result, globally, IQ scores are getting steadily higher. Since 1950, they've gone up 20 points. That's a huge statistical jump. And there are signs of intelligence everywhere if you look for them. To pick just one tiny example that I thought was amusing, there are more museums in the US than there are Starbucks and McDonald's combined. And it isn't just that people are getting smarter. Here's trend 8. Our technology is getting smarter as well, except for your phone. Compare where we are to where we were 50 years ago. Today, your cell phone has more computer power than all of NASA back in 1969 when it sent 2 astronauts to the moon. More recently, in just a decade, we basically fit all the computing power in the machine on the left into the machine on the right. What that means is, in Africa today, a Maasai warrior on a smartphone has better access to information than the president did just 15 years ago. And that Maasai warrior probably does have a phone. Cell phone ownership in Africa is approaching US levels. There are now more mobile devices than people in the world, 7.2 billion cell phones, so that today more people have access to cell phones than toilets. The growth will continue. Ericsson released a report this week that says 70% of the world population will be using smartphones, not cell phones, smartphones, by the year 2020. We take this kind of progress for granted, but it raises a real question. How has this happened? Well, you've heard of Moore's Law, which just celebrated its 50th anniversary. The number of transistors on a chip continues to double every 2 years. This is what that means. In 1956, a gigabyte of storage cost $10 million. Now it's under 9 cents. But what does that look like? Literally, it looks like this. This is the evolution of the game character Lara Croft from 1996 to last year. The game machine you have at home today is literally millions of times better at rendering the character in real time. It used to take hundreds of people to create a computer-animated film. This clip was made by one artist in Australia working by himself. And change is accelerating. 500 years ago, technologies were not doubling in power and halving in price every 18 months. That's part of why the world's data is doubling every 2 years. And a lot of that data is images. Consider this. Here are a number of cameras sold worldwide. And this is what happens when you include the cameras in cell phones. The bars in yellow. Actually, it looks like this. And what about video? All of Hollywood now produces about 1,000 hours of film every year. That's how much video is uploaded to YouTube every hour. And all that information is spreading. This is how quickly the world is getting on the internet. This is an image of part of the internet. This is an image of part of the human brain. And this is the remarkable thing. All the digital data in the world is now equivalent to one human brain. In other words, the internet now has about the same number of connections as each of you do. That's today. It's going to double every year. And so the internet will have as many connections as all mankind by the year 2045, 30 years from now. And artificial intelligence is already making big strides. Some recent examples, at Google, they scanned 10 million video thumbnails, and the computer figured out, all on its own, that a bunch of them were images of cats. Microsoft has a deep learning project that now outperforms humans in image recognition. Meanwhile, Skype will translate speech in real time while you're on a conference call. It knows 50 languages so far. And without any instruction, a computer taught itself to play video games from the 80s and 90s. It could already beat almost any human. There's a lot of progress in the interfaces between humans and machines. For example, the recent launch of the Apple Watch, Siri. But there are even closer connections. A man controls a cybernetic hand with his thoughts. Another man controls his bionic leg, again with his thoughts. A paralyzed woman has flown a fighter jet simulation using only her mind. Scientists are reading dreams using brain scans. By wiring you up, they can now get information about what's going on inside your head, even what you're looking at. On the left, what the person is looking at. On the right, what the computer reconstructs from brain scans. Just yesterday, this headline appeared on CNN, quoting Ray Kurzweil: "Humans will be hybrids by 2030. Stephen Hawking says it's theoretically possible to copy the brain onto a computer and so provide a form of life after death. He also thinks it'll happen within that 15 to 20 year period. But on the other hand, he also thinks the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. So not all the news is good. Which leads to the last trend I'm going to discuss today. We are replacing ourselves with machines. And frankly, I don't think anyone knows how this will play out. I'd like to start by talking about a new kind of robot, the car that drives itself. The thing is, there's a software bug in cars, the driver. Every year that leads to 10.8 million crashes, 2.3 million injuries, 32,000 deaths in the US alone. Globally, it's 1.24 million deaths. And 94% of those crashes are caused by human error. Those red diamonds are car crashes in LA during one rush hour. That's why LA drivers spend 90 hours a year stuck in traffic. That's 90 hours you could be using to read, sleep, watch TV, or even get a couple of extra weeks of work done if you didn't have to operate your car. With self-driving cars, our highways could handle 3 times as many cars. And think about how it could change our cities. Today we use 25% of city land for roads, and another 10 or 15% for parking. But even with all those parking spaces, we still spend about a third of our driving time looking for a spot. In the UK, motorists spend 106 days of their lives looking for parking spots. So there are a lot of reasons self-driving cars make sense. But the real question is, how soon will your car drive itself? Do you think it's A, within 10 years, B, 10 to 25, or C, more than 25? Who do you think it's A? Optimists, entrepreneurs. How about B? And how about C? Well, according to Morgan Stanley, self-driving cars will be commonplace within the decade. This car from Google will hit the roads this summer, and so will self-driving Teslas, enabled by a software update. An autonomous car just completed a road trip from San Francisco to New York. And self-driving cars will be in road tests in 30 US cities by the end of next year. A McKinsey study says almost every car on the road will be self-driving within 25 years. And the thing is, you probably won't own that self-driving car. You'll pay for just the rides you need the way you pay for a bus ride or a taxi or an Uber. In San Francisco, Uber is now 5 times bigger than the entire city, taxi fleet, and limo fleet combined when they started. That's because many have figured out using an Uber anytime they need a ride is cheaper than owning a car. Imagine how much cheaper it'll be when the cars drive themselves so you don't have to pay the driver. And that's not going to be long. Uber has teamed up with Carnegie Mellon to make it happen. There's a simulation of traffic in Lisbon which showed that self-driving taxi bots could replace 90% of cars. So what happens then? In the US, there are 6 million jobs driving trucks, buses, taxis. Those jobs are going away. It's already happening. This is the Rio Tinto mine in Australia. 50-foot robot trucks are making mining safer. There are 900 of them hauling iron ore 24 hours a day, which is longer than any of us can drive. Self-driving trucks just got approved in Nevada. This is Mercedes-Benz concept of what a self-driving car could look like. Because when you add up all the costs of letting humans drive, the crashes, the injuries, the deaths, it's no wonder Elon Musk thinks cars you can actually drive will be outlawed eventually. But here's the thing. It's not just drivers we're going to replace with robots. A recent report suggests nearly half of US jobs are vulnerable to computerization. Actually, it's not as bad as that. It's only 47%. But that's within the next decade or two. This is already happening. A Chinese restaurant owner has ditched his human waiter for robots. A robot butler is making room service deliveries. Robot bartenders, this new cruise ship has them. What about robot housemaids? Not only do they exist, they're teaching themselves to cook by watching YouTube. We don't have rocket mailmen yet, but earlier this year, Amazon got FAA approval to test drone delivery in the US, and they're also working on the UK. What about robot warehouses? Well, they already exist. You may notice a few humans, but Amazon has already deployed 10,000 robot workers, and in China, Foxconn has announced plans to buy 1 million robots. Robots are replacing traffic police in the Congo. There's a 300-pound robot security guard. Samsung has unveiled a robot sentry that can kill from 2 miles away. Earlier this year, a British robot mapped the radiation at Fukushima. And NASA plans to use robots to build the next generation space station. Maybe mining on the moon actually is closer than we think. Or on Mars. And that may happen sooner than we think. Elon Musk again, he aims for humans on Mars by the year 2026. Then there are jobs you'd think only a human can do, jobs that require a lot of brain power. But those jobs are going too. If we have self-driving cars, there's no reason to think we can't have self-driving airplanes. Maybe it's time for robot pilots, but they probably won't look like this. Telcos are replacing call center staff with Watson. Scientists aren't safe. A robot scientist just discovered a malaria drug after screening thousands of molecules looking for a fit. Why hire a lawyer when computers are cheaper? In a recent liability case, one reviewed 2 million documents all by itself. IBM wants the FDA to let Watson diagnose patients. Eventually, we may not need the doctor at all, or the surgeon. Have you been to the hospital lately? The robo-surgeon will see you now. Even journalists are at risk. Earning reports and sports recaps are being written by robots. Though I'm not sure the robots will understand behavior like this. And finally, it's not just human jobs that are at risk. Who needs a sheepdog when you've got a drone? So what happens when all the jobs are gone? Jan Tallinn, one of the founders of Skype, says, in the long run, we should think about how to organize society around something other than near universal employment. And Mark Andreessen, who invented the first web browser, has written, posit a world in which all material needs are provided free by robots. Imagine 6 or 10 billion people doing nothing but arts and sciences, culture and exploring and learning. What a world that would be. That's transforming the narrative. And if any of you have any ideas about how to accomplish that, the world wants to know. So we've talked about 9 trends. And now I'd like to make one prediction. My prediction is simply that all of these trends will continue. That's the real news. And there are 3 reasons I think it's important to understand this. First, you'll be happier. You'll realize the world is less scary than the media says it is. Second, you'll be more optimistic about the future. And as entrepreneurs, we need to stay optimistic in the face of anything. And finally, you'll see all kinds of new opportunities for your business. Here's a quote from Warren Buffett that sums it up. Throughout my lifetime, politicians and pundits have constantly moaned about terrifying problems facing America. Yet our citizens now live an astonishing 6 times better than when I was born. The prophets of doom have overlooked the all-important factor that is certain. Human potential is far from exhausted. We are not natively smarter than we were when our country was founded, nor do we work harder. But look around you and you see a world beyond the dreams of any colonial citizen. Now, as in 1776, 1861, 1932, and 1941, America's best days lie ahead. To which I'd add, the world's best days lie ahead. And if there's one thing I'd like you to remember from my talk, it's this. No, not the snow melter with twin power plants and flame-throwing jets, as awesome as that would be. We don't have that yet. Seriously, what I really want you to remember is this. Things are better than you think. Thanks very much.